Hello, I'm Rick Edwards, the Chief of Police for the City of Richmond. We've been asked to provide some additional details regarding the mass shooting that took place in Monroe Park in June of 2023. We've been unable to share that additional information due to pending litigation. Recently, in response to a question by a local news organization, the Office of the Commonwealth Attorney signaled their office would not be pursuing future criminal charges related to this shooting. We know that there's a lot of public interest in this case, and now that future prosecutions have been ruled out, we're able to discuss some of the information we've been asked about previously. We'll be able to share some investigative files and photographs that have not previously been released. As you can see, this is a photograph of the crowd right before shots are fired, about 1 minute before. And it's easy to understand why so many people were injured due to the density of that crowd. This tragedy included 2 that were killed. First was Sean Jackson, age 18, who was one of the graduates, and his stepfather, Renzo Smith, age 36. 5 people were injured by gunfire, 4 adults and 1 juvenile. As you know, following a 4-day jury trial, Amari Pollard pled guilty to first-degree murder and use of a firearm during the commission of the murder of Sean Jackson. Now I'd like to discuss the firearms that were recovered at the scene. First was a Glock 9mm handgun recovered from Amari Pollard. Second was a Smith & Wesson .380 handgun recovered from Renzo Smith. Third was a 9mm High Point, also recovered from Renzo Smith, but determined to have not been fired during this incident. Finally, a Shadow Systems 9mm handgun that was recovered from a parked vehicle. It was later determined by investigators to have not been involved in this incident. This slide denotes the locations of the cartridge cases recovered from the scene. And while it does show all the cartridge casings that we recovered, it's important to note that some may have been lost in drains or even caught up in the tire treads of passing by cars. As you probably know, semi-automatic pistols eject cartridge casings when they're fired. Here's a crime scene photograph with evidence tents that show the locations where those cartridge cases were recovered at the crime scene. Here you can see the markers that denote the locations of evidence recovered during this complicated case. Detectives determined that this incident began with Amari Pollard shooting at Sean Jackson a total of 6 times. 2 of those bullets were recovered from Sean Jackson's body during the course of the autopsy. 2 additional bullets were recovered from the crime scene. The remaining 2 bullets fired from Pollard's 9mm handgun were never located. Although bullet fragments were recovered from the scene, they were unsuitable for comparison to any specific firearm. This video still shows the locations of Amari Pollard, Renzo Smith, and Sean Jackson just after Amari Pollard started shooting. This graphic shows the ballistic evidence for 4 different firearms. The yellow belongs to Amari Pollard's firearm, the green belongs to Renzo Smith's firearm, the blue dots were determined to be from one of the juvenile's firearms, and the orange dots were determined to be from the other juvenile's firearm. Here is the location of one of the juveniles who discharged his firearm. The Office of the Commonwealth Attorney determined that this juvenile was firing in the defense of others, and as you can see, this juvenile shot towards Amari Pollard as Renzo Smith ran in front of him. It's important to note that the bullet that struck Renzo Smith in his back was recovered and is suitable for comparison, however that firearm has yet to be located. This video still shows the other juvenile firing his weapon at Amari Pollard. As you can see, a red sedan is driving in between them. The back window is shot out and the victim in this case was grazed in the left shoulder. The Commonwealth Attorney has determined that this juvenile was also firing his weapon in the defense of another. This video still shows the location of injured individual number 2. He was wounded in the right leg. A bullet fragment was recovered, however it's unsuitable for comparison. You can see his location in relationship to Sean Jackson and Amari Pollard. The bullet fragment that was recovered from the wound was not suitable for comparison, so investigators were unable to match it to any firearm. Here is the location of injured individual number 3 at the corner of Monroe Park, who dropped down to protect a family member. He believes he was struck by a ricochet. The bullet fragment recovered was also not suitable for comparison. Injured individuals number 4 and number 5 were also wounded during this incident. However, none of the ballistic evidence recovered is suitable for comparison. This overhead image shows the locations of 4 of the 5 injured individuals about a minute before the shooting starts. One of the individuals who was shot was in a car at the time and is not captured in this image. This video still is looking across the street towards Monroe Park, and as you can see, Amari Pollard is running southbound across the street where he ended up in a parking deck. He was later taken into custody by VCU security staff and VCU police, and his firearm was recovered. Now I'd like to clarify a few things. First, there's no evidence that any firearms were brought into the Altria Theater. Second, there's no evidence that Sean Jackson was ever armed during this incident. Video evidence and witness statements from involved individuals establish that firearms were obtained from vehicles parked near the event at the conclusion of the ceremony and prior to any contact in Monroe Park. Now I'd like to focus on the shooting of Renzo Smith. As mentioned previously, Sean Jackson did not have a firearm. We determined that Renzo Smith did not shoot himself, and it's also determined forensically that Amari Pollard did not shoot Renzo Smith. Detectives were able to identify and locate 2 juveniles that fired their weapons at the scene. One juvenile reported that he dropped the firearm he used in the James River. Several attempts were made by dive teams, but they were unable to recover this firearm. A search warrant was executed at the other juvenile's home. 9mm handguns were recovered from that search warrant, however they did not match the cartridge cases recovered from the Monroe Park scene. Both of these juveniles were charged with weapons law violations as it relates to this incident. Although 2 juveniles were identified as having been present and firing shots at this scene, the available evidence suggests that those shots were fired in the defense of others. Based on that evidence, Virginia law would not hold the 2 juveniles criminally responsible for any injuries that occurred at the scene. Complicating matters was the fact that despite extraordinary efforts, law enforcement was unable to recover all the firearms used in this incident. Therefore, the forensic evidence could not and did not conclusively establish beyond a reasonable doubt which, if either, juvenile caused the injuries to any person during the shooting. Finally, since Virginia law protects the privacy of juveniles, law enforcement cannot provide any further information about the 2 juveniles involved in this incident. June 6, 2023 was one of the worst days in our city's history. Graduation ceremonies should be a sacred place where young people can celebrate their accomplishments with their families and loved ones without fear. After a lengthy investigation, it was determined that Amari Pollard shot Sean Jackson after a dispute regarding a justifiable homicide of an individual that both parties knew. As you know, this was a complicated case involving a chaotic scene, multiple people firing weapons. Some of the ballistic evidence was unsuitable for comparison, and some of the weapons have yet to be recovered despite exhaustive efforts. The purpose of this video is to provide some additional information to the public and to answer some of the questions that members of our community still have about this case. I hope we've done that.